This is Critical Nonsense, our high-lowbrow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, Joey asks me if there's any way you can catch a bad idea.
Woo! And it's Jess. Just kidding, it's Joey. This is what a Joey sounds like. But it is also Jess because this is what an executive producer and the new girl, Jess Vander, sounds like.
Hi, this is Jess. This is actually Jess.
The real one.
The real one.
We have no Aaron this week. Alas, we can all cry
Sad.
tears. All the Aaron stands, you can stop listening now. But you have Jess and I, which is, double J's, the J team. We're out here. We're ready. Jess, housekeeping. We started last week doing little clips from the show. If you want to see what we look like while we talk a little bit occasionally, we may start posting some of those on YouTube. And we're also going to start putting the audio of our show on YouTube as well, because I guess people listen to podcasts there sometimes. So, give the people what they want, right? That's what I always say, Jess. I say that, right?
Yep, you do.
Corrections department. Vital correction. Jess, do you want to take this?
Submitted by our very own Alex Contel, sound engineer. It's important that we clarify the individual that was described as Jose Salamango is actually Jose Salamago. And we just need to set the record straight. And we appreciate our personal Spanish language.
Yeah, I've still been receiving continued comments about our maple syrup corrections department.
What? Why?
I think it's just, and I've been thinking about maple syrup all the time. Addition, I guess the comments weren't more corrections. They were just things like the fact that you can go to a corner store in Canada and get your maple syrup jug filled up on tap was an amazing finding that we have learned since that show. So if you have maple syrup facts, please feel free to send those to us as well.
I'd like to think that in the same way how 7-Eleven in America has bring your own vessel for Slurpees on July 11th, if in Canada there's an equivalent day where any size vessel will suffice and you can fill it up with maple syrup. I mean,
just bring an oil drum.
Yeah, exactly. Save up your store for the year. There's just no way that you consume maple syrup that fast.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess not. All right, Jess, I think that brings us to one of your favorite types of episodes and mine as well, and I'm sure all the listeners. Joey has a thought that he needs to figure out, and he's going to do it with Jess.
Yay! I'm ready.
That's the segment.
Let's do it.
We need to tighten the segment name in the future. So I was joking with you about this before the show, but part of me is just does not want to talk about cancel culture. And also cancel culture is so prevalent and continues to be so prevalent that the constant exposure to it just invariably gets me thinking about it, over the past. Go ahead.
Is it the Cuomo thing?
It's not the Cuomo thing, but the Cuomo thing also fits in this. It's the Republican conservative, what is it, CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, had their conference 2 weeks ago, and the theme was cancel culture. There's been all these conversations about canceling Dr. Seuss and a lot of canceling Mr. Potato Head and whatever. And in all of these cases, they're largely just not true, but it's being used sort of as a political stick right now. And we don't need to go into that aspect of it, maybe, although I don't know whether the political aspect of cancel culture is avoidable.
Mm-hmm.
But in some of these things, and, there's been, and we can talk about this as well once we get into it, there have been a lot of conversations around The Bachelor and is dealing with a wave of cancellation related subjects. And so as I've been thinking about this and also through the lens of the political or like the broader cultural discourse, what has come with this is like, even people who, right, like I can't be canceled because I don't have enough stature to be canceled, right? Like I could be reprimanded, but like this idea of like, oh no, I'm going to get canceled becomes like a topic of conversation in like regular, like uncancelable people, like as a joke, like, oh, don't cancel me. I'm just going to say this idea that's like an opinion about something that is not whatever.
Yeah.
And where I started thinking was I got to Richard Dawkins somehow, and this idea of if ideas are viruses, which is like where the term meme comes from. It originally comes from Richard Dawkins, I believe, in his book, The Selfish Gene, talking about like memetics and how ideas spread. And he then later had a essay that he wrote in the early 90s called Viruses of the Mind that were all about sort of contagions of ideas. But if we think of ideas as something that you can catch, and a bad idea is something that you could get and need to then be able to treat somehow, it got me into this idea of like, what if bad ideas are actually like a public health issue? Like, what if we started treating bad ideas in the way that we think about treating someone who is sick? And this idea of like, ultimately what I think my question for you is, so I can stop talking and you can talk, is, what if we could cancel ideas without canceling people?
It takes me straight to CRISPR, which
yes,
the layperson's visualization as described, I think, by Radiolab. I don't remember exactly where I heard it first, but it was about like, imagine this like tiny assassin going through and isolating having like a wanted poster and like isolating exactly only the things that are on the wanted poster gene equivalent and excising it. It's a very visceral medical idea of how can we just cut out the tumorous thing, the bad thing, and then save the rest of the things. But I think that's in part the challenge with canceling in general, is how big is the tumorous thing? And maybe you just got to take it all out. You got to amputate it. You got to get rid. And this is where the CRISPR part just falls by the wayside. Like, what if we can't get that hyper targeted? And how do you distinguish just the idea part? And I guess that's where I'm wanting to focus us a little bit. Is like, is the problem, just one idea? And what if it matters how big that idea is, for instance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or the preponderance of bad ideas. Yeah, I mean, I think like part of what got me here was thinking about like ultimately what we're doing is in this, if you even believe in cancel culture, which by the way, like is sort of an outstanding question of like, does cancel culture even exist? I think like there are things around the Me Too movement where there are like very specific behaviors that people did where they're being canceled, which I think is very different than just having like a bad opinion or a bad idea about something, right? Like Harvey Weinstein didn't get canceled. Harvey Weinstein was a criminal and is in jail because he had specific behaviors that were, abhorrent and not accepted within society. And so I think it's important at least to distinguish between those things. But then this idea of, like at least like the theory around cancel culture as it's being presented by people who are against it is like, I have an idea that you don't like, and therefore I'm going to be canceled as like a penalty to eliminate an idea. And so there's definitely like this like thought police arena that sits on one side of this, where I'm going, the idea of like treating bad ideas as like a public health issue that you could, help remove, as you said, like a cancerous idea, in theory is interesting, but then who's selecting the ideas is always sort of the question. Like, how do you decide whether a bad idea is bad or not?
Exactly. It takes me straight to a conversation that I had in college with a professor of mine who was really frustrated around Halloween because there were a lot of people who had many opinions about what counts as a Halloween costume or not. And he was just in sort of a grumpy mood and was sort of ranting about it. And one line continues to stick with me that I agree with. That I don't know if everyone would, but I strongly agree with what he said, which was like, you're not entitled to an offense-free life. Like you're gonna get offended by stuff, and other people will have opinions you don't like. And at what point is something that is offensive to you genuinely a bad idea, or just an idea that is unseemly in your eyes?
Yeah, that you don't like, right? Yeah, and I think like we've spoken in the past about like Jonathan Haidt and the coddling of the American mind, right? Like this concept of safe spaces being sort of a protection, like you're saying, from ever being like offended or encountering discomfort. And I think this is where the discrepancy or the question of where do you draw the line on these things, right? Like I think generally like we're going through this moment with race and culture right now where we're saying like this is bad. Like people are being treated unfairly. And there are people who are growing up in, both just like as Americans, we've been indoctrinated with bad ideas. And even when we talk about, in recent episodes with Aaron of like, capital T, capital W, the work, like doing the work of sort of re-educating yourself is in some ways, right? Like treating this as like a public health issue. Like you were given an idea at a young age when you didn't necessarily have the ability to, challenge these ideas or sort of contend with them intellectually. And so they just become indoctrinated into part of your worldview without you even necessarily seeing it, right? Like the ideas of the patriarchy and things like that, where it's like there are these like subtle cues that you're given your entire life, and it takes effort and energy to sort of figure out where they exist, right? Like in a conceptual MRI where you're like scanning like where does the disease exist in my own worldview. But like I think those ideas where it's about sort of like the ill treatment, subjugation, or disempowerment of like groups of people broadly as a society, I think we agree with. How good we're performing on resolving those issues is a question. But then when you start to get into other areas, it's like, where is a good idea? But we talked a little bit about this ahead of like, what are some areas that we could discuss that might work as sort of like an opportunity to examine this idea of like, could you treat bad ideas as like a public health issue? And maybe that's what like propaganda is in sort of like the Stalinist, sort of way of like trying to insert a new idea into society. But we talked about like conspiracy theories as an example. And I think, what we've been seeing in culture with QAnon and how that impacted, the events of January 6th and the insurrection at the Capitol and all of those ideas, right? Like that's an example of a bad idea where people had these ideas that are sort of verifiably false. Like there is evidence to demonstrate like that these things were not real. And so is there a way that where you can start to contend with something like that through like a public health effort?
Yeah, I mean, play on that metaphor a little bit more, and it's like, okay, well, if you're going to take that thing out, you have to sub in something else for it, right? So like find the source of the issue, which is like very valid, like fears, insecurities, financial, emotional, so many other things, and substitute it with something that is realer or better, so called. I think what's interesting about this test case of conspiracy theory is it's more cut and dried, I think, right? Like, it's not a real thing, though the sources of fear and concern are the real thing. So you can excise the part that's not true or bad, and in a theoretical universe. I think what's harder is the thing you were talking about earlier, and maybe we need a test case for this, which is if you're trying to work on re-educating yourself, or you're trying to grow and evolve, the target is shifting constantly versus a universe of conspiracy theory where it's sort of a suspension of a certain moment or a thought, an idea that's constantly changing. Like virology, that is way harder to pin down. If it's mutating, what are you going to do?
Yeah. I mean, I think like you're right. There are some of these ideas that are static concepts, and then some that are evolving, right? Like this idea, in part, was inspired by the way that there's sort of an increasing shift in the way that we're thinking about addiction and drugs in society. And I think, the thing that we always go back to, because it seems to, at least to my knowledge, be like the first major experiment with this, was how Portugal handled its drug crisis by turning it from a criminal issue into a public health issue and beginning to treat addiction in that way, right? And so the war on drugs that we had in the U.S., through the Bush administration and whatever, Portugal was like, we don't have enough money to handle this problem that way, so we have to try something different. And the result has been extremely positive, to where now, DC and Oregon are decriminalizing drugs altogether and things like that. Other people are working through this same experiment. And so, that's an example where there was this static idea, like drugs are criminal, and the ideas that you could replace it with was like, no, drugs are a public health and mental health issue, and so we should treat it as such, right? So there's like this nice one-to-one versus, QAnon is not really one conspiracy theory. It is actually a cluster of ongoing and new conspiracy theories that are evolving one after the other. I mean, it's sort of around a central conceit anyways, but
yeah, I mean, the Portugal story is the way you treat this idea is by reframing what the thing is. It's a lot of what people are talking about with, regardless of how you feel about it, like defunding the police, meaning not money should not be going towards helping and protecting the people. It's just, it should go to different types of things to protect and help those people in different ways. And I think this is getting at it, certainly in a public policy universe, the reframe the issue to help something be more efficient to solve it is definitely one way to try to treat an idea. But yeah, when you're talking QAnon, that is, it's messier because the concentration of the issue is also not consistent, right? Like different factions may be suffering from different challenges that, conspiracy brings everybody together.
Yeah. I mean, there is something like within this, right, about the idea of like, we all have bad ideas, right? Like through this idea, like if you're viewing it through this lens, like we all have them, right? The question is like, are they detrimental to others, and or does anybody care, right? Like, some of the ideas that I have about, I don't know, health or diet or whatever, like everyone has like really weird, quirky ideas.
What's a bad idea you have?
Before the pandemic, I would wash my hands when I went to the bathroom or like when I'm doing dishes or things like that. But I was like, I was like hygiene hypothesis, my immune system is going to be better if I'm letting more germs come in. So I was like, I'm like, outside of like, going to the bathroom or sort of, I like specifically got something gross on my hand. I was like, we need more germs and we're being too clean. So like,
Goodness.
how can I introduce, and then that's like an example of like, I'm not necessarily doing anything to hurt anyone in that process. And so it's like, a lot of people are like, ooh, that's gross. You're a disgusting person. Please, you're not allowed to come to my house. You can't play with me. But it is just like a dumb idea. But the question is like, when you're catching these ideas, it comes back to this idea of like, what if someone's a good person who has legitimately bad ideas? Do you dispose of the whole person, or can you like remove the idea?
Yeah, I mean, I liked the thought that you'd mentioned earlier about propaganda and how to use it to benefit. I was thinking about a bad idea that I have, and one of them is that I know intellectually that being at least vegetarian, if not vegan, is good for the earth and net probably a good thing for my health, and if I were to do it right. But once I ate too many vegetables and I found myself losing my addiction to sugar and fattening things, and I found it terrifying because I was like, it's a burger and that's supposed to be delicious, and that I'm not craving it is very scary and socially ostracizing. And so I was like, I'm not willing to give up food, and so left that concept behind. This was so long ago. But the idea that enough propaganda or social sway could change that and get not just me, but a lot more people to reduce their consumption of meat is better for the world. And I don't know what kind of campaign needs to happen to make that change, but for my sake, selfishly, I would like that to happen so I don't feel stuck in my own bad idea.
Yeah, there's part of this, right, that is like, I relate to that idea, and like and climate change is like another area where it is sort of like there's verifiable evidence that sort of the current climate change is like man-made, a product of human relationship to fossil fuels, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But people catch a bad idea when they're young, right? Or they catch an idea that's sticky and they don't have the faculties at the time when they catch it to contend with it. And would it make us more empathetic when we're contending with people that have caught a bad idea, right? Like you literally, even if you're using that type of language, like the idea happened to you, right? Because a lot of these instances, they're not original ideas. Like people are passing on like a particular phrasing of an idea that is just so sticky.
Yeah.
Right? Like in the climate change example, people saying like, climate always goes through cycles. We're just currently in a warming cycle, right? Is like, you can show the evidence to show that that's not true. But if you're like, oh, you caught a bad idea.
Yeah.
Like all of a sudden I would be more empathetic in trying to explain to you that you're wrong versus like trying to fight you.
And you being the person who's caught the idea, in that sense, the idea being less associated to your identity, this belief being entangled in who you are means that you won't necessarily go down with the ship fighting on something dumb.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's not the person, it is like an externality, right? Like the bad thinking about climate change is not like you as a human. It is like, oh, you caught a bad idea. Like, let me help you. You need some soup.
Speaking, I'm feeling like everything's coming full circle because this is my favorite thing that I probably talked about before on the show about the Spanish language, which is that the Spanish language puts responsibility on everything else but the individual. Like if something, like if you drop something, like the way you describe it is that like it dropped or like the a thing like everything like happens to you, like I have hunger, like hunger is like a thing that you have, it's not something that you feel. And I like the idea that there's a linguistic starting point to this whole conversation, that maybe could be the way that we could start loosening our grip on the bad ideas that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is right. Like, if you start to think about ideas external to you, or we describe, it's not like, I mean, I guess in some ways you say, I have an idea, right? Like, is sort of in the way that you would say, I have a cold, is sort of interesting. But the rest of the language, right? Like dissociating ideas from people is interesting. But again, I think we come back, as we start to wrap this up, to the question of like, what are the ideas where we're approaching these, and sort of, where do you draw the line where everyone needs to have the same idea? And that's like, you're just treating to sort of like create like a monoculture of ideas, versus which ideas are legitimately harmful, and how do you treat those, right? Like, where does it cross the line? And that's the part I don't know. And that's where it gets scary, like in my head, where I'm like, oh, what if ideas are a public health issue? Like, I started getting excited, and then I was like, oh, but then like, who's in charge of deciding which of my ideas need to be excised or not, right? Like, which of my ideas are tumors and which of my ideas are beauty marks?
That sounds like the log line to your next sci-fi novel.
Yeah. That's a freckle, and oh no, that one has cancer, right? Like, yeah, which of my
out
ideas
with the lot,
Yeah. Do I have to get my moles removed? My brain moles.
Oh my goodness.
I think I don't know whether we've resolved anything in this conversation.
No, not even close.
We did a pretty good job of not getting too far into cancel culture necessarily, which was kind of a hope, even though it was like sort of the impetus for this, right? Like,
yeah, did you
Potato Head?
Out?
What about Mr. Potato Head? Are you saying my kid can't have a Mr. Potato Head?
Did this help? Did you learn something new?
I do like the aspects of this where we're sort of pushing this outside of ourselves and finding opportunities to talk to each other more empathetically, and giving, I think what it does for me mentally is sort of gives opportunity for forgiveness. But I think in this case, like, you can't have forgiveness if you're not, again, like doing the work for like the treatment of a bad idea. And so that question of, what needs to happen as part of that, like, I don't know. It makes it easier to have a conversation with people in your family or something, right? Like,
yeah,
when someone brings up like, climate change isn't real, dinosaur times were hot, like says like some stupid thing like that, then you can be like, oh, you caught a bad idea. Or, like someone grows up in a culture that has like, is not like in totality bad, but is sort of like has bad ideas within it that you sort of invariably are going to pick up if you grow up in that culture. It sort of gives you the opportunity to forgive that person while still trying to like work with them to help them,
Yeah, and also all the while recognizing that you are that to somebody else and that they definitely would be easier or more able to identify your bad ideas and be like, oh, the poor soul.
Yeah, like I can tell you, so I wrote a piece that like leading up to the 2012 Obama election for McSweeney's, which was a letter to my prior self in 2004 when I voted for George W. Bush. And it was like humor piece. It was in McSweeney's, but it was like the gist of it was like basically I'm realizing like I caught bad ideas from sort of like the men in my life and like in New Hampshire at that time that were like born out of fear, right? Like this idea of like fear and like jingoistic like war sort of things. And like I voted for George W. Bush then, like not something I'm proud of, but it was like, you know, I was like 18 years old and was being fed these ideas around like you have to be scared and like the if you don't go to the war's coming to you, you know, like those types of ideas.
Back when you talked like that?
Yeah, that's what I talked like a old man when I was 18. But it is like an example for myself of saying like I caught a bad idea and it took like time and like learning and sort of getting the opportunity to have like a little bit more perspective to understand that like what I was being told was not like 100% accurate and was like based a lot on emotion and opinion and you know you grow as a result of that, but I still needed to have that surgery to have those ideas removed, you know.
Yeah. And the recovery sometimes is not comfortable.
No.
For some things.
You need a walking boot for a while.
You really, yikes. Well, Joey, I think that's it.
Was that the wrap-up corner? You need a walking boot? All right.
Well, and sometimes you need a walking boot. From Joey's previous accent.
Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain Labs production.
Recorded.
As always, we want to thank you, Jess. You're an executive producer and a canceller of people.
And I'd like to thank you, Joey, for being uncancelable, as well as Aaron.
Because I'm so insignificant.
That's right. But Aaron, who's actually significant and just not here.
No one can stop buying if they're not buying. As always, we'd also like to thank our sound engineer and uncancelable, not because of insignificance, but because of perfection, Alex Kuntel, and designer Nora Mestrich for her beautiful everything that she creates and being our friend.
We can't forget to thank the production help and wanted poster detectives Sarah Gilbert, Les Jacobs, and Tony Vaughn. Thanks.
And as always, thanks, Ellen.
Thanks, Ellen.
Special thanks.
Special thanks.
Do we have special thanks this week? What are you thankful for, Jess?
I'm really thankful for strawberry shortcake, which I had this week, and it's really good. And maybe that's the one thing I'm grateful for.
I am grateful for, however cliche it makes me, and I hate the name, Pamplemousse LaCroix. Their play on pamplemousse. Pamplemousse. I drink way too much of it, and I'm grateful for it. I'm also grateful for Kim's Convenience because it's just funny. Yeah, it's just funny.
I've got to get myself to watch that.
It just feel good, you know.
I'd like to thank Pasteles de Nata, which are the Portuguese egg tarts that then went to Hong Kong and became the Danta, the egg, which I definitely butchered just then, the egg tart that I grew up loving at dim sum brunch on the weekend. That stuff is so good. And then when I was at this Portuguese bakery in Madrid, which is not the place to find a Portuguese bakery, but whatever, I went there and I got the real thing. And it was amazing. So everyone should get themselves one of those at your nearest opportunity.
Oh man, you just made me think of dim sum, and I'd like to thank ham soy gak, which is like one of the types of dim sum dumplings that's like, I think it's like a deep fried taro dough with sweet pork in the middle.
Is that the one that sort of like looks kind of like a savory cotton candy on the outside?
No, those are good too. So maybe it's not a taro dough. It is like a sort. It is more like maybe it's like a glutinous rice dough because it is squishier. It's not like that other
Is it the turnip cake?
It's not the turnip cake. Also delicious. Basically, we're
so
just
many
thanking
good things.
all of dim sum. But hamsoegak is, which also obviously I'm butchering as well, is what I call teardrops from heaven because they are so delightful. It is like sweet and savory and like just right up my alley.
Wow.
I want to go to dim sum.
I know I want dim sum.
Can the pandemic be over and we can go to dim sum?
That would be pretty awesome. Hey, listeners, if you're out there, when the pandemic's over, come to New York and we'll all go get dim sum together. The tables are meant for many. So
just spin the lazy Susan. Thank you, lazy Susan.
Thank you. No, you're
I don't know what Susan did
to deserve this.
To get called so lazy, but whatever you did, Susan, I appreciate your invention, and so I think it's the brilliant Susan. Let's call it the brilliant Susan. Let's redeem her name. Let's uncancel Susan. Because
or was Susan the woman who used it the first time? Or is she, Susan, the spinning wheel?
Susan. Why are you so lazy? It's actually ingenious. It allows us to spin it around. Oh, it seems kind of lazy to me, Susan. I don't know why. I've fallen to a southern accent. I'm pretty sure accents are cancelable now. So I will be canceled.
I mean, Joey, if you were more important, you probably would have had something to be canceled. Something worth being canceled for by now.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
Oh, but we appreciate
all right, with that,
you.
Happy week. Love your faces.
Get yourself dim sum.
Tune in next week for another episode of Dragon Ball Z. Goodbye.
Bye.